It feels right that we enter a time of prayer after that piece. I invite you to close your eyes. If that feels good, to move inward, or if not, open them facing the world. Gather by the river that is your body. Gather by this inland lake, your body 65% water. Gather by this place that quenches our thirst for justice, keeps us connected for the hard work of collective liberation. In this moment of silence, notice the water that you are. May we know ourselves exactly as we are to be the flesh of this sacred earth we call home. Amen. "30 days for the earth." I want to kick us off today with two vignettes. You'll notice I love to use my hands. Two vignettes. Vignette one. I am seated in a group, predominantly white, listening to the leader of a permaculture farm, who is also white. And as we are speaking, one of the people in the group says, "I hate living in the city and the suburbs. I long to be in the wilderness." And the gentleman at the front of the room lovingly says, "The task is to see the mountain in the concrete." See the mountain in the concrete. See the tree. Don't let it become dead twice. Vignette 2. I'm seated again, predominantly white group of people, being led by a man who identified as indigenous. And as we are sitting there, we are thinking like a mountain. So we are dreaming as mountain. We are aching with the pain of mountaintop removal. We are hearing stories from folks who are in that waterway where the oil and the remains continue to wash down as more and more of the mountain is chopped off. Tears are streaming down people's faces as they imagine themselves as mountain. The individual at the front of the room says something like, "It is so moving that you are so touched by mountain. I worry that you have an easier time imagining being mountain than you do imagining what it is like to be faced daily with police violence. I worry that it is easy for you to think like mountain than think like me." Two vignettes. The question we ask going into 30 days for the earth is, why is it so hard to dismantle the separation we have from ourselves and the earth as the flesh of our bodies? Why is it so hard that we have inherited? We are in this epic, philosophical, structural watershed of stories, forms of science, belief systems that have told us for centuries upon centuries that we are separate from the world around us. And now we are faced aching, wondering why it's so hard to remember mountain and to ache for our fellow human beings faced with the violence of our lives every day. So the question I bring for us: how do we honor the flesh that is our earth and the flesh that is our fellow human beings as the project of 30 days for the earth? That the two are not separate. And although it wasn't our fault that the separation happened, it is our responsibility that we tend to the separation and create wholeness and transformation once more. So where did this hot mess, this hot philosophical mess, come from? One, the recognition for us that some bodies and that some ways of being were marked as non-being. For example, in dominant, I'm going to list them, are you ready? European, Western, heterosexual, white, Christian, cisgender, male culture, there were certain bodies that were marked as primitive, we've heard that, dark, unwieldy, uncivilized, and this included women, even the white ones, should they act out, people of color, indigenous people, and Jewish people. For example, 40,000 witches burned at the stake in Europe and the United States. For example, black and brown bodies being identified as the missing link between white people and the natural world. You've heard this. Am I saying something that people haven't heard? Am I saying something that people haven't heard? Black and brown bodies, such as Oda Bena, 23-year-old Bushman from Congo, who was discovered and became a traveling exhibit, a human being brought to the Museum of Natural History, then sold in 1906 to the Bronx Zoo, where the description above him said that this was the evolutionary missing link. He was housed in the Primate Museum. We know this imagery is still alive when we remember the cartoons about Barack Obama. We know that this imagery is alive in this hot mess of a watershed that we are in together. Doctrine of discovery. Third example, Pope Alexander VI, 1493, says that any land that Christians are not on is unoccupied land. This was the doctrine that allowed Christian settlers to take indigenous lands without impunity. This doctrine was recently cited as recently as 2005 in a United States court case. To act like these philosophical messes are not present with us is to not really know why we experience the separation. We are dealing with a watershed inheritance of separation. We have inherited a cultural dominant belief that some of us are being and some of us are non-being, that our world is non-being. So, in tracking this hot mess and recognizing, as I say these words before I go forward, that this is hard to hear, and that for some of us in the room may be harder, and to take a breath at any point in this and to know your dignity as we sort through the lies that we are dealing with. So what happens to non-being? We have two obvious ones, maybe the second not so obvious. Here are my hands again. One, if you are a non-being, you get abused and used for extractive purposes, right? We see that one probably more easily than we see the second one. Also happening to non-being is conservation and protection. keeping something pure. Follow me. Our modern ecological movement has made sacred and important gains throughout our history, particularly during industrialization to curb consistent and abusive resource extraction. However, as we talk about the beauty of conservation, we must enter even that with complexity, because nothing is left untouched by the fierce and false separation between being and non-being, the flesh of our bodies and the flesh of our world. For example, Carolyn Finney, a Black cultural geographer, writes in her book, Black Faces, White Spaces, about conservationist John Muir. He is a beloved conservation activist, the one who convinced Teddy Roosevelt to come to Yosemite to protect entire watersheds, to honor ancient trees. He created and supported the contribution of several national parks. He is the tenant of the Sierra Club. I think there are so many people with tattoos of him on their arms, walking the PCT, especially after certain movies. He influenced Thoreau. He talks and talks and talks about how sacred the wildness is. We have his quotes on freeways reminding us of why we've conserved so much of California. He has been enormously influential. And John Muir described Black people as lazy and not quite able to pick cotton like a white man. John Muir, in his essays on national parks, wrote, "Indians are basically dead, or they've been civilized into useless innocence." And if you think that this is just a man in context and history, let me add this. He describes bears as poor fellows who have been poisoned and trapped and shot until they've lost their confidence. John Muir had more ache for bears than he did for his fellow human beings. And at the same time, when he was saving tracts of land as part of America's cathedral, legislation was simultaneously being signed that said certain people, indigenous people, people of color, were not welcome in the United States. So do you hear this? It is subtle but important that the move to conserve something as pure is mirrored at both times. That the move to conserve resources for someone's splendor and the move to prevent people of color from moving in the United States is related. They have a common ancestor. Nearly 100 years later, in 1964, two pieces of legislation would be passed simultaneously: the Wilderness Act and the Civil Rights Act. These are huge landmark bills that are still used today. Nevertheless, they were not in conversation with each other and perhaps have actually enhanced our sense of separation as beings. Let me say why. The myth that we are tracking and that we will dismantle, hopefully, a little over the next month is this: that our dominant modern culture emerges out of a recent 2,000-year ancestor that believed that natural resources were to be extracted and used by certain bodies, that some of us were beings and some of us were non-beings, and that white, straight, male, property-owning Christian bodies were beings, and that all other forms of flesh were meant to serve the capital interests of those particular being bodies, and that some bodies, bodies of people of color, indigenous people, women, the body of the earth, water, land, air, must either be, one, put to good use, building more capital for white bodies, or be useful in their purity and untouchedness as an inspiration for the pioneering imagination of white, straight male property-owning people. And that Christian bodies, when they need to restore their imagination about the natural world and their rightful place in it, could go there whenever they wanted to. And thus, a tension is held that we still carry today. We have been willing to acknowledge in our faith tradition and ask questions and take careful action to address the ways that Christian white supremacy influences even our congregation. that voices that we name, that songs that we sing, that realities that we center, that ways of being, behaving, and lamenting are part of white supremacy. Similarly, as we enter 30 Days for the Earth, let us also be willing to acknowledge and ask questions and take careful action, that even our sacred environmental imagination has been influenced by a mythology of being and non-being, and that our work together theologically, socially, politically, in our wildest imagination is to dismantle the separation and to be alive again in the world, to see and recognize ourselves and each other as being, to see and recognize ourselves and the bodies around us, the church around us, the earth around us, the concrete around us, the oil around us as part of an extensive sacred being. What happens when we keep these separate is marked in one particular incident specifically. It's a little-known incident in 1960. A white professor of theology wanted to plan a vacation to a Canadian national park for his wife and an African-American couple from the United States. The white professor wrote the owner of one of the rental spaces at the national park, wanting to ensure that his African-American colleagues would be treated well. The white professor described this husband of the couple as university-trained, 4 degrees, an author, and underscored that both the husband and the wife were highly cultural people of superior character. He did not get a response from the owner right away, but when he did, it was not the answer he hoped for. The owner of the rental stated that because they get so many American guests at their national park who love their national park so much, that he just couldn't accept responsibility for possible embarrassment that might arise when the couple arrived. The irony of this story is that the African-American couple was Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. Dr. King was exhausted from his civil rights work and wanted the chance to renew his spirit and focus on his writing, and there's no doubt John Muir would have understood that. To address the control that forms both of these, we need an antidote. Our recommendation, our hope for 30 Days for the Earth is that we move away from what feels like ethics of control that come as both abuse and conservation, and we shift into an ethic of risk and relationship. There is something better than control and conservation, which both keep something at an arm's length. Better is risk and connection, risk and rubbing up against that which is our flesh, that which is the flesh of the world. Anthony Pinn, a Unitarian Universalist, African-American humanist theologian, talks about 3 characters that he sees underscores Black humanist theology. The first one's Thoreau. The second one, Frederick Douglass. The third is Harriet Tubman. Why Harriet Tubman as someone we can hold and lift and learn from and kneel at with humility now is because Harriet Tubman held both. The knowing of what is our natural world with the knowing that what we do must both support and change and transform the flesh of our world and the flesh of the people around us. It is not enough, although important, to do our individual behavioral changes, but to lean into the relationship of those most impacted by the false separation of being and non-being. A closing story. Reverend Tara and I have known each other a long time. And I once met with Reverend Tara when she was riding a bus of 12 young adults across the state of California. And she was doing that because she had the only one among us with the license to drive that vehicle, which we'll never do again. It was actually a brilliant ploy to keep you driving. As we're driving up and down the state, we're meeting with people, we stop up at Shasta, we drink from the headwaters. Sacred, holy moment, feeling the water in our bodies that start all the way down California. We go to organic rice farms. We visit people who are preventing dams with their bodies, preventing dams that are going to be built that will actually flood sacred burial sites. We stop in the Central Valley. And by this time, all of us are feeling very proud of all of the behavioral changes we're ready to make. Number one, getting rid of our plastic bottles. No offense. Someone just threw back. It's glass. It's glass. We were so ready. We were really pumped, right? We walked into this community water center, and we had our little plastic water bottles in tow because we had just met with people that Nestle had bought out. We had met with the town that Nestle had bought and privatized their water sources. So we were like, no, we're done with that. We roll into this community water center in Visalia, California. The community organizer, a member of the community, says to us, how many of you brought your plastic water bottles today? And you know, with our UU pride, we flipped that up, we put them on the wall, like, here's my plastic water bottle. She said, good for you. Good for you. I can't drink the water that comes out of my faucet. At which point she pulled from behind her a plastic bottle of copper water. This is what comes out of my water faucet. We were humbled that this right here, although sacred, right? We're in, let's do it. If we are not rubbing and in relationship and in risk and in humility with the flesh that is our earth, and the flesh that is our human bodies, we will miss the real issue. We will miss it. May 30 days for the earth be a time where we awaken to the being that is all around us, and that is in the humans around us, and is in the people we do not yet know. Amen.